grace I seek in this and all other matters. It's just sideways. I think just leave it flat.
Flat?
Because I won't be able to read numbers sideways after a certain point.
Okay.
Thank you, Muslim Women's Network of UK, for bringing me out to Birmingham. I caught the train all by myself. That's like really a big thing for me because I'm such a klutz. And also because Faiza is a graduate of one of the first courses that we had in Musawa before Musawa was even launched. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the evolution of Islamic feminism. I want to be able to tell you something about my experience with it, also how it relates to feminisms across the spectrum. I love this topic because it really is dynamic. From the beginning, I was vociferous about not being called a feminist. And that's also why I love this topic, because things had to change in order for me to be at the place where I am now. Some of the slack that is still out there was effective. Some of you might know, you have a copy of my first book, just hold it up for a second. This is the first book, which came out in 1992. How many people were not born in 1992? Go ahead. Yeah. And at the same time, it's still my bestseller because when I accepted Islam in 1972, so I'm working my way towards my 50th year as a Muslim, and in all that time, this trajectory of my life has continued with great blessing, a lot of resistance, a lot of challenge, but the blessings are really what I see the most. I had already been the religion of my birth. My father was a Methodist minister, and I grew up in a loving household. In fact, I took the name Wadud, that means loving, because I was raised on a loving God. But I also seem to already be aware that religions were not monoliths. And so I really wanted to look into other faith systems, faith practices, faith philosophies. When I entered freshman year of university, I began studying Eastern religious traditions, Hinduism and Buddhism, and I became a Buddhist. And I live in a Buddhist ashram, and I started practicing meditation, which I still practice today. After the experience with Buddhism and the sort of settling down that happened with the meditation, I began reading about Islam. And my undergraduate institution was University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and even today there's a very large and dynamic Muslim presence, and that presence is powerfully, I think, balanced between people who accepted Islam by choice and people who were born into Islam, who had come into the city either for universities, several of which are still there and quite prominent, or for work. So this eclectic community was all around, and also obviously like Muslim Students Association. So Islam was also sort of vibrant locally, even as I was reading it sort of with regard to abstract principles and the like. And the first time that I went to a mosque, it was on Thanksgiving Day in 1972. So I always celebrate Thanksgiving Day as my Shahada Day and give thanks. Plus I like turkey, so I need that excuse. I really wasn't ready for what it would mean. I accepted to take the Shahada because that's what the guys said, because they were really impressed that I came in and I was covering my hair and I was wearing long clothes, which is a political decision that I made because my ancestors were brought into America from Africa, and they didn't have a choice about how they would appear in public. So it's a very conscientious movement, especially among Black women, to not wear revealing styles. So I was a part of that kind of cultural movement. I was young, I was good looking, I wasn't fat. I am now, so that's why it's an issue. But I didn't appreciate being heckled in the streets and stuff. So I just naturally gravitated towards covering. And so while I was reading about Islam at the university, and I went to this mosque, as I said, the guys were like, well, you know, you're already covered, you should just take a shahada. And so I did, and they gave me a little booklet about how to make salat, which I just sort of like poured over. And then I went back to the university and kept reading. And I would come back and forth because this was in Washington, D.C. where my parents lived. And I was in Philadelphia for the university. So I would just come back and forth and visit my mom, and I would always come on Thursdays when my last class was done, so I could go to Juma on Fridays. And then I started connecting to communities in Philadelphia. But one of the visits back, one of my childhood friends, because once I start reading, I start talking. So I'm always talking about, you know, what I'm learning. So I started talking about Islam all the time. I actually chase people out of my house, you know. I used to play chess, and as soon as people would come, I'd open up the chessboard and start playing. Then I started talking about Islam, and they were like, you were talking about that last time I was here, you know. Guess what? Almost 50 years later, I'm still talking about Islam. That just goes to show, you know. So it was natural for me, I think. But my childhood friend, I guess, had been proselytized by these same guys. It's an issue with women, so they definitely wanted to get wives, so they were taking people off the street. And she said, oh, I know something about that, and she gave me a copy of the Quran. Now, for me, I would recommend being aware of the Quran way earlier than I was, but for some reason, that's the path that Allah chose for me, because honestly, once I started reading the Quran, I fell in love. And when I fell in love, it was clear that this was in Arabic, and that if I really wanted to understand the book, I would have to immerse myself in the study of Arabic, which I promptly did, except that this was March 1973, and the Arabic course took a whole year, so I had to wait until the fall semester began, and I couldn't wait, so I just started teaching myself, and you know, I learned the alphabet in 2 days, and then I went back and redid my salat according to Arabic and not the transliteration, and I started memorizing surahs. You know, it was the most motivating experience I've ever had in my life. I was only 20 years old, so you know, maybe there were other motivating things that happened later in life, like having children, but at that time, you know, it just drew me in. And fortunately, because the title of this book is Quran and Woman, fortunately I stayed with it. I eventually got that undergraduate degree with 3 years of Arabic studies, went to live in an Arabic-speaking country for a couple years, then came back, then went to graduate school and got my master's and PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies, but my focus was always on the Quran. So that motivation in 1973 has stayed me throughout my whole life. And because of that, that sort of like nerd status of reading, remember in the old days when they asked your hobbies, I used to say I was a reader. It's not really very exciting, but that was all I knew. I mean, I didn't do sports or, you know. So there was this intimate relationship that happened with me and the Quran, even just reading it in English, which today wouldn't do as much for me now having gone through all this time with Arabic. Because once I started graduate school, I went back to a more advanced and intensive level of Arabic studies, and then I went to a special intensive Arabic program in Cairo for a year, and you know, picked myself up to a level of fluency. But again, I knew what my focus was. It was the Quran. We had resources because this program was funded by certain offices in the U.S. government, and they hired for me a tutor from the University of Cairo to study Quran one-on-one. Maybe I'll get a chance to tell you a little bit about what happened in there with him, because it was also part of what became important for me to understand, and that is, how do we read the Quran? How do we understand it? And because the Quran lifted so much burden off of my shoulders, because it expanded my bosom so much, I was like pretty kind of like fundamentalist, you know. I covered my face voluntarily back in the 1970s in the city of Philadelphia in the United States, because I opened up into this wonderful, marvelous place, and it just brought me so much satisfaction. I didn't need anything else, you know. I didn't need any other philosophy or anything. I just, you know, it just captured me, you know, enough to get a master's and PhD. In fact, I was married twice, and I had two husbands that were in the same program for the PhD, and they did not finish. So between them, I was the only one to successfully finish, because I was so motivated, you know. When I completed the PhD, pregnant with my 5th child, that's the other thing, between them I had 5 children, I, you know, had to work. I mean, I wanted to work, and when I looked for work, I remember going for my first job interview with a black hijab, and after that, it's like, don't do that again, because it intimidates them, especially thinking that, you know, this is the 90s, right, or actually the late 80s. It intimidates them not only with the black hijab. I try not to travel with the black hijab, that's what I was saying. I'm on the train and I don't know what I'm doing, and everybody was very helpful. I said, despite the black hijab, I never went to interviews again with black hijab, because when you know an area of study that the people who are interviewing you don't know as well as you know, that's already intimidating. And then you also have this appearance of foreign, of different, of somewhat inaccessible and everything. So after that, I just try to be so friendly, and I make little jokes when I talk, whereas really I'm really a very serious person, you know. So I wasn't able to get a job in the United States. And I was offered an opportunity to apply for a job at the International Islamic University in Malaysia. And it was just getting itself, you know, in a good role, fairly new. I was actually the first woman who was an assistant professor with a PhD, because they also trained their lecturers. They sent them out to do the PhD so they could come back. Now it's a different story, but I'm just saying, it was 1989 when I went to Malaysia, and within 1 month, I began meeting with a group of women who would later consolidate some efforts that they had already had going, sort of like Muslim Women's Network UK, and they started Sisters in Islam. We managed to understand the intersection between Islamic thought and Islamic practice with regard to issues like gender and social justice. And it was one of the first Muslim women's organizations that took seriously Islamic scholarship vis-a-vis the agenda of women's empowerment, equality, justice, dignity, and that kind of thing. So it gave me a place, because otherwise I was just all in my head, all up in the text, which I still am, but the application of it to real life really was like a second kind of motivation for me in my life. It really made it important that it wasn't just a utopia in my head, you know, that I could actually see ways to apply it in terms of making reforms and areas of personal status law and public policy and the like. So I'm very much indebted to Sisters in Islam. They also were the ones who introduced me to the mall. I never did the mall. And now, you know, I don't do the mall that much, but when I go to Malaysia, I definitely do the mall, you know. So, you know, it wasn't all work, is what I want to say. We were friends, we're still friends, 30 years. It's like amazing to be a part of something that's sustained itself for so long. But when I finished with the editing of my dissertation, and I finished that book, which I published first in Malaysia with a blue cover, I began to see sort of like the larger picture of Muslim women's empowerment work, Muslim women's self-realization and activism, Muslim women's thinking, ways of knowing, ways of being. I began to see it in a really much more integrated and dynamic way. For the Beijing conference in 1995, Sisters in Islam attended. It was the first of the global women's forums that had such a viable presence of Muslim women. And the funny thing is that when you were there, you know, all these different types of hijabs, they always appeared in the papers every day, because they were just so fascinated with these women, you know. So we tried to form a caucus. You know, somebody else funds you to get there to be represented in these, you know, in these conversations, sponsored also by the, you know, United Nations and development programs and women and gender and family and all of that. So people were from everywhere. So it's like, oh, we should have a Muslim Women's Caucus. And all they did was argue. No, I'm a Libra and I don't do really well with that. So I just went off and watched the Koreans do sacred dance because that's the kind of person that I am. But it really brought home what later I would characterize as the two dominant perspectives or voices or trajectories on the issue of Muslim women's empowerment. And I want to tell you a little bit about them because they help to shape, where I'm going to go eventually. One voice is something that I now call secular feminism. There are Muslim women who identify as feminists and who also internalize what at that time, it's no longer the case even in the West, but at that time, the dominant voice of feminism was anti-religion. And it was specifically the inclusion of religion in the conversation over rights. The reason that they were anti-religion is because they felt that, and I'm going to specify it now, although this was bigger than just Islam, they felt that you cannot have both Islam and human rights, or Islam and feminism. And when you're pressed with your back against the wall like that, and your activism is towards women's empowerment, then you just say, keep religion out of the debate. Even in that, there were a spectrum, because some would say religion is personal. That's what I do personally. I'm sure you've heard that, because people still say that now. That's my personal. But the intensity with which they would say you can't have both Islam and human rights or Islam and feminism meant that when the other dominant voice started articulating its location, they came to loggerheads. And the other location, remember, this is 1995. By this time, there is a clear presence of political Islam. And political Islam or Islamism formed the next most dominant voice at Beijing. Interestingly enough, more men were present to represent this perspective on Islam and women than any other place I've ever been. It was just kind of par for the course. But the Islamists also said you cannot have both Islam and human rights. You cannot have Islam and feminism. And in the space where they were in agreement, eventually would become the mechanism for how to challenge both of them and to move forward. Because we were there and we were not at any one of those locations. We were, especially in the Malaysian context, because I went with a Malaysian NGO, Sisters in Islam, we were able to align ourselves with Islam and yet not to align ourselves with some of what we had witnessed and experienced or faced in the courts, in the culture and the like, in the name of Islam, vis-a-vis the rights and justice and dignity for women. So they were not trying to move away from Islam, they were simply trying not to be oppressed by it. And yet and still, they did not enter into and affirm the political Islam articulation, which is Islam is the best, nothing can be better than it, there's no human rights instrument that can be better than Islam. And as they literally would pass out papers while I was in Beijing, we just have to understand the wisdom of Islam's position on women. So what happens actually is that both Muslim feminists or secular feminists and the Islamists, both of them defined Islam only in patriarchal and conservative terms. They also both interpreted feminism as necessarily being outside of religion, or in this case, Islam. So it's true in terms of religion as a whole, but I'm gonna keep it just talking about Islam for the sake of reducing how much there is to go with this. And we went back to the drawing board. Now, going back to the drawing board at that time, all non-government organizations, with the exceptions of those that are started by the wealthy people who do philanthropy, need funding in order to continue their programs. And there's like grassroots funding, and there's bake sale funding, and there's, but to really get the organization up and going, Sisters in Islam also needed funding. And we were rejected for funding in a very interesting sort of consequence of what we witnessed in Beijing. First of all, let's be clear, about that time, the Gulf money was flowing everywhere. Every poor Muslim circumstance, every minority Muslim circumstance, the money was flowing. So if you wanted to get money in that pocket, then you had to affirm this conservative, patriarchal, hegemonic idea about Islam. Could not talk about Muslim women's empowerment. You could not talk about Muslim women's consciousness raising. And so we couldn't get funds there. We still can't get funds there. The other major funder were all of those, sort of UN and human rights and sort of the global north fundraising to, liberate Muslim women. And they had a set discourse which the secular Muslim feminists aligned with very well. So that's what they were looking for, and that's where they sent the most of their funds. So we really were sort of tooth and nail to try to maintain our location. And I think in a way, despite the fact that, it's difficult when you're starting an organization, you're trying to maintain it, and it's just on a voluntary basis. That's a reality, but it is difficult. Despite the fact that it meant things went kind of slow, waiting to, for the bake sale to give us enough to be able to do small publication and the like. Despite that, I think in a way it kind of pushed us back to help us get greater clarity about this ease that we had with both the sort of secular feminist location at Beijing and the Islamist location at Beijing, because we're sort of between the rock and the hard place. And what we needed to do was a sort of an epistemological venture. Who defines feminism and how is it defined? Coincidentally, Western feminism was also going through its different phases, and it was also in the 1990s that intersectional became like one of the words. It doesn't mean everything that everybody thinks it means, but I like what everybody thinks it means, and that is we are not simply oppressed by one thing. Class and race and ethnicity and language that you speak, levels of education, ability, disability, sexuality, gender location, all of these things impact on forms of oppression. So sometimes you're not just oppressed because you're a woman. Sometimes you're oppressed differently if you are a woman that's not white, for example. So mainstream Western feminism was already being challenged by others in the West for their lack of intersectionality. And even when they dealt with the intersectionality, in my opinion, they still had not quite gotten globally, paradigmatically. But that came as a part of the trajectory. So third world feminisms sort of started around that time. But the real question was, who defined Islam? And who had the authority to define Islam? And how did they define it? And we took up the task of challenging both of these locations, in some ways intuitively, unconsciously, maybe even unintentionally, simply because of our survival. You're pushed back by the secular feminists who say, oh, they're just Islamists. You're pushed back by the Islamists who say, oh, they're just secular feminists. They're Western feminists, right? So you're pushed back by these two things. And again, when your back is up against a wall, you sort of have to fight your way out of it. And for us, because Sisters in Islam was an organization that took very seriously the relationship between Islamic thought, Islamic scholarship, Islamic intellectual traditions, and the struggle for gender equality and justice, it gave us a different means for resolving what turns out to sometimes be reduced in the women question or women's issues or whatever. And we saw it in a greater sort of systemic thing that basically defined Islam only on patriarchal terms. So let's talk a little bit about patriarchal terms. To me, patriarchy is a form of thinking that requires any two different things, people, locations, ethnicities, classes, whatever, when they come together, that difference means one of them has to be above the other. And so when we would talk about gender justice or gender equality or women's rights or whatever, the next conversation would always be somehow we're trying to put men down. And the reason why it seemed like we were trying to put men down was because there was only one way to think with regard to two things coming together. And it was okay for men to put us down, because that's the patriarchal hegemonic way of thinking, and not just in Islam, because that had been the norm. It wasn't something that was created by Islam and Muslims, and yet, in my estimation, it is something that can be dismantled by Islam and Muslims. But in order to get that dismantling, we had to rethink this whole rubric of what is Islam and who gets to say. And when you're at the early stages of these kinds of inquiries, it's very difficult to find resources to try to sort of explain, what's going on. So, again, Beijing in 1995, and we're now 2015, somebody did the math faster than me, that's 25 years, right? So we've passed 25 years since Beijing, and in that time, it's not so strange to challenge whose thinking is having control over how a thing is put forward. So for example, in the context of the UK, where Islam is a minority, but it's a substantial minority with a population that has been here for a long time, it's also clear that Islam is diverse, even just amongst British Muslims, right? The right, the opportunity, even the possibility to think of Islam as diverse, to not think of it as a monolith. We always say Muslim women are not a monolith, right? We say Muslim women are not a monolith, but all of the discourse about what is Islam and what is the Muslim woman still has these kind of characteristics. And so eventually you're responding to those as if they are in fact characterizing what is Islam. And so again, it's epistemology, it's hermeneutics, it's a way of thinking. And with the rise of Islamophobia, I'm hoping it's pretty clear that extremist Islam and Islamophobia both articulate Islam the same way, which is so weird if you think about it, And yet, when we are part of Islam, one of the next things that we do is we kind of go to the next extreme, which is to say, well, that's not really Islam, and they're not really Muslims. When actually, we're just a spectrum like any other religion or any other people, right? But we were not given permission to allow that, and we're not under the force of Islamophobia, we're not given permission to have that diversity because we're trying to challenge certain things that have real consequences on us, real consequences on the ability of our children to be able to get educated, to move forward in life, to make choices with regard to career, profession, and contribution, and all that. So it's a real force. And that force started about the time that political Islam, came to the front and began to kind of locate itself. And then, of course, political Islam went to its extreme end. So everything